All right, so kind of get going here. Couple things before we dive into material, just to kind of catch us up. Hope everybody had a good break. Where we're going for the remainder of the semester. So, last night, the last module reading was due. So later this afternoon, I'm going to update Canvas. And I'm going to drop kind of your lowest module reading. So your scores might change a little bit in that category because I'm going to drop, as according to the syllabus, that lowest module reading now that they're all turned in. Okay. Now the two lowest quizzes will get dropped. I'll go in this afternoon and also change Canvas so that it drops your two kind of lowest quizzes, although we still have one more quiz to go. So it's going to be kind of like a best case scenario. If you do worse on the last quiz, things could change a little bit to that grade. But if you've missed a quiz or something like that, having kind of that lowest drop will kind of give you a bit more of an accurate representation of where your grade is at in that category. So I'll make that update later today as well. But we'll still have a Module 13 quiz posted after class Thursday. That's due next Monday. Okay? We'll also have two more in-class quizzes this week, right? After Thursday's class, I'll update Canvas so that it drops your four lowest in-class quizzes according to the syllabus, right? So after next Monday, you should have an accurate idea of exactly what your score is in the quiz, in-class quiz, and module reading categories. You can then kind of play around with that hypothetical grade tool. I mentioned it or showed you kind of after the last exam, kind of plugging in different hypothetical final exam scores to see what your grade in the class would be. I'll revisit how to use that and revisit that next Tuesday in class after we kind of have all these assignments turned in and I can update Canvas to kind of drop those lowest scores. You're also going to have one more final assignment, which will be posted after class Thursday, which is the fifth and final Canvas discussion. That'll be due at the end of next Friday. Now, if you have missed a Canvas discussion, it's very important you do this one. It makes me not angry, but just sad when people don't do them because they're relatively easy points. Great. So there's still one more. If you've missed one, it's an opportunity to pull your grade up in that category quite a bit by doing the remaining Canvas discussion. If you've done all of them up to this point, well, if you don't do the fifth one, it's also a way you can lower your score, right? So all of you should make sure you're getting on after I post that Thursday. I would suggest do it Thursday or Friday of this week so you don't forget about it. And I'm sure I'll mention it in class and try to remind you, but get it out of the way early. I know you have other finals you'll start preparing for next week or taking next week. So that'll be posted after class Thursday. Do it at the end of next Friday. So you have plenty of time to get on and get it done. But I would try to get on and get it done at the end of this week just to get it out of the way. Okay? Other than that, that should kind of lead us into the final exam. So this week we have new material. That's what that Module 13 quiz will be over. That's posted after class Thursday, due next Monday. Next week, no in-class quizzes, right? So that incentive is removed. But there's a much larger, in my opinion, incentive to show up to class next Tuesday and Thursday, which is I'm just going to be reviewing problems that look very similar to what you're going to see in the final, right? So I would make sure I'm in class next Tuesday and Thursday. That's going to have, I think, be pretty beneficial towards your final exam score. The final, it's in the syllabus off the top of my head. I hope I'm getting this right. I believe it's the 16th is that Tuesday of final exam week from 5:20 to 7:20. I don't know the location yet. It likely won't be in this room. We might get lucky and it might be. I don't know yet. I'm waiting on the university. That's someone above me makes that decision of where we're going to be. As soon as I know that information, I'll pass it along to you. Okay? But that time and day is locked in. It's just the location I don't have yet. Okay? Now, I've got that practice final up there. So next week, primarily, next Tuesday, Thursday, we'll be going over questions from that practice final. We can review old quiz questions as well, kind of once all of those have passed and closed out. But next week will just be for review. So one last week of material, new material this week. Okay. Don't think there's anything else I need to mention. Any other questions for me logistically before we jump into material here today? We're okay. Oh, there is one more thing, but I don't have an answer yet. I will hopefully have an answer on Thursday. I'm trying. There will be CL sessions this Thursday and next Monday. I am working with my CL leaders to see, even though there's not new material, I might have them sign up for if they want to. I can't expect it of them given that it's close to finals week. But that Thursday of next week and then the Monday of final exam week, I'm going to have them sign up if they want to do some like extra review sessions. for just to be available for you guys. I don't know how many there will be or exactly which locations yet, but that might be, a final opportunity for some extra credit there as well, adding an additional CL session. Okay. Other than that, any questions before we jump into material here today? Everybody made it through the snow? Okay. I also grew up in Michigan, so I say a little tongue-in-cheek. To me, first of all, it's insane how well they clean campus up, given the snow, but this really isn't that bad. It can get a lot worse. But anyways, we're all here, so who cares, right? So what we're going to talk about this week is monopolistically competitive markets. So up to this point, we've talked about different markets. So the final is going to be over the last 4 modules: perfectly competitive, monopoly markets, game theory, right? And those oligopoly, duopoly markets, and then now monopolistically competitive markets. So this is a pretty tough module in that we're combining kind of things we've talked about before, but it's in a slightly different context. So what we had was, on one extreme, we had monopolies. One firm, they're the only person selling this product. On the other extreme, perfectly competitive. Many, many, many sellers. They're all selling the exact same product, though. Okay? So the kind of in-between, we didn't focus on it primarily just with game theory, because there we were looking at individual decision-making. But then we also looked at, with game theory, how can we understand these duopoly markets where there's 2 firms? And you would use a very similar thought process to look at oligopolies, which is 3 or 4. I'm not going to push you that far. We only looked at 2 firm models. But the other in-between would be, let's assume we have many sellers, but it's not of the exact same product. Everyone's selling a slightly different product. So I had someone come into my office yesterday, and this was the dumb example I used, and I'll use a better one throughout the rest of the class probably. But we didn't differentiate in previous modules a lot that there's market demand for a product, and then each firm has their own demand. It didn't make as much sense to make those distinctions, but if we remember, when we talk about perfectly competitive markets, do you remember what we said the firm's demand curve was? So if I want to sell this product in a perfectly competitive market, I have to charge the equilibrium price, so my demand curve as a firm just became horizontal, or it just was that equilibrium price. Now, the overall market demand for that product still was a downward sloping demand curve. So there is a difference between the demand curve the firm faces and the demand curve for the market. Now, with a monopolist, is there a difference between those two? Well, no, they're the only firm. Their demand is all of demand, right? With monopolistically competitive markets, this distinction between market demand and firm demand becomes more important, okay? So we'll think about this maybe there's some overall demand for sweatshirts, right? But we know not every sweatshirt is the same. I don't know. I don't know the popular brands for people your age right now, but I was, thinking about things I don't know. If I was to go in and I want to buy an Under Armour sweatshirt that's really nice, I'm going to pay a much higher price than if I want to buy the Walmart brand, right? They're still both sweatshirts, but they're slightly different quality, right? So different companies, when we have monopolistically competitive markets, it's the same product, but they're slightly different. Some are of different quality. Some, might have be a fad currently or a different color. All the attributes are going to be a little bit different. So they're going to have some monopoly power. Not complete monopoly power over the sweatshirt market, but some over their specific type of sweatshirt. Okay? So that's what we're going to be thinking about. Many sellers, but their products are slightly different. Right? So what we're going to assume, we have many sellers in these monopolistic competitive markets, but just like a perfectly competitive market, firms can freely enter and exit. Right? Unlike monopolies, where we might have had some barriers to entry that only allowed, a patent, that there was only one firm. Okay? And then we have this, I already mentioned, product differentiation. So some other examples, the one that I'll probably run with a lot today, fast food, there's some overall market demand for just getting lunch from somewhere. But right, Popeye's chicken is very different than McDonald's hamburgers, right? They're differentiated products. But they're still all pulling from the same demand, which is, I need something quick for lunch, right? Apartments, and once again, I think I might have used this in an earlier class, but if you're making the decision now, you're probably a little bit behind, at least from what I remember about being in college in the apartment market. If you're making decisions for next year, thinking about what apartment you're going to buy, what apartments can likely charge a higher price? Ones that are closer to campus, right? It's an attribute that gives them some monopoly power, and allows them, we know that a monopolist relative to perfectly competitive market is going to choose a higher price, right? Now, if they increase the price too much, what do you choose to do? I don't know, live in an apartment where I got to walk 2 miles, right? I can't pay a couple $1,000s a month or whatever it is, right? And so when the apartment market, we really can think about this as a really good example of a monopolistically competitive market because all apartments are not the same, right? There's some overall market demand. All the IU students need somewhere to live, but these new apartment complexes are different than these like buildings that look like they should maybe be condemned, right? When you're looking at some of them. So we know that we have slightly different products, which is going to result in different prices, okay? So we're kind of in the in-between, right? We look kind of like a monopolist because we have somewhat of a unique product. It's not completely unique, right? There are some substitutes, but like nobody might have the same exact apartment that I have in the exact same location relative to campus, right? So I've got a little bit of a differentiated product, so I'm not quite a perfectly competitive market because that was a homogeneous product. That was like my 87 unleaded gasoline was like the good example of that. It's the exact same product. We don't have that anymore. But we still have free firm entry and exit, which is going to result in some long-run outcomes that look very similar to a perfectly competitive market. But some of our long-run outcomes for these monopolistic competitive markets are going to look kind of similar to monopolists. It's like a mashup of the two, okay? So we'll kind of walk through these today, thinking about what this is going to look like. So in the short run, what's going to be true? Every market we've looked at, burn this in your memory, tattoo it on your arm, right? Whatever you want to do. How do we choose the profit maximizing quantity regardless of what market we're in? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Same rule applies in these markets, right? Now we're going to have a slight difference. We're going to kind of mention something that I might have briefly mentioned with monopolies, but we didn't focus on it. Here we're going to focus a lot more on it in these monopolistic competitive markets, which is even when they're choosing this profit maximizing quantity, if we have free firm entry and exit, we're going to end up with profits being equal to 0, but these firms are still going to be setting a price above their marginal cost, okay? So this is what we're going to refer to as the markup. So to kind of do a little bit of a review here, but if I think about a perfectly competitive market, so there, if I'm thinking about the quantity of the firm's demand curve was simply that perfectly competitive price. It was this horizontal demand curve. We said in the long run, what are profits in a perfectly competitive market? We got to know this going into the final, otherwise scores are not going to be good, right? In the long run, firms enter and exit until profits are 0, right? So we end up in the long run where that profit maximizing quantity for the firm results in the price being equal to average total costs or profits are equal to 0, right? Now, what's also true, if I'm thinking about the definition of the markup, is the difference between the price and the marginal cost. What's true about my markup in the long run from a perfectly competitive firm? Well, price is the exact same value as my marginal cost, so markup is also 0, right? So the markup in these perfectly competitive markets was 0, profits are also 0. What we can have with these monopolistically competitive markets, and I'll draw for you what a long-run equilibrium is going to look like. We'll build out why it is what it is here in a little bit, but I just want to kind of compare and contrast the two for a second. So let's say I'm thinking about a monopolistically competitive market. They're going to face a downward sloping demand curve, right? Because their product is slightly different. They don't have to charge the equilibrium price. If my apartment is closer, I can charge a slightly higher price, right? So I have some monopoly power. So we said, what's true about a single price monopolist? Their marginal revenue curve is going to be twice as steep as demand. So the monopolistic competitive firm, their marginal revenue will be twice as steep as their firm demand curve. Not the overall market demand, but that firm's demand curve, okay? So let's say, so I want this to be here. Here's my average total cost curve. So let's see. trying to draw this. It's supposed to hit it at its minimum point. I got close, right? Marginal cost hits average total cost at its minimum point. So they're going to make the decision, where is the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So MC I'm just using here to shorthand monopolistically competitive. Okay? So this is where the monopolist, it's going to look very similar to a monopolist, right? In terms of they have this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. However, with a monopolistically competitive market, just like a monopolist, they choose the quantity first. How did the single price monopolist set the price? They then went up to the demand curve, right? So the monopolistically competitive market will operate in the same way to set their price. So in the long run, if this is the long run depiction, which you'll have to trust me for right now, that it is, but what is true about my price relative to average total cost? So remember, profits are the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. Here, price is equal to average total cost, so the profits are equal to 0, right? However, what is my markup for these monopolistically competitive firms? Well, if it's the difference between price and marginal cost, if I'm going up to the demand curve to set my price, what will always be true about price and marginal cost? Price will be greater than, or my markup is going to be a positive amount, right? So even though we're going to have 0 profits for these monopolistic competitive firms, they end up with a markup. Now you can kind of think about if I was a firm, obviously my ideal goal is to maximize profits. But what would be correlated with that is, what is price? When I sell something, it's essentially my additional revenue, right? And my marginal cost, it's like my additional cost. So like the last unit, my additional, revenue is going to be greater than my additional cost. Or on average, my additional revenue is greater than my additional cost. So do I want my markup to be higher or lower? In general, I'm probably going to want it to be higher, right? So a perfectly competitive market, there is no markup. Monopolistically competitive markets, there will be, right? That difference between price and the value of marginal cost here is something positive, okay? So it's kind of, like I said, it's going to be kind of a mashup of the two, right? We get 0 profits in the long run for these monopolistically competitive markets that didn't look like a monopoly. Monopolists in the long run had positive profits, but we also have a markup that exists just like we would with a monopolist, okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. So I've got the different depictions here as well. We can just kind of take a little bit more of a step back. So here's the firm's demand curve if it's a perfectly competitive market. It's just horizontal, right? My monopolist, their demand curve for that firm is the entire market demand. So I've tried to draw this in a way, and it may not be super clear, but I'll try to point out here. If I am in a monopolistic competitive market, if there's, say, we said there's many sellers, so let's say there's 20. Firm demand will always be what relative to market demand? Well, if I'm splitting the market demand with 19 other firms, my firm's demand curve will always be less than market demand, right? So it's going to start out at a point that is lower, right? I'm only going to be getting a portion of the overall demand for apartments, right? Now, what will also be true? With a monopolist, there was no other substitutes. With a monopolistic competitive market, even though my apartment might be unique, there are tons of other apartments you can choose from. So if there's more substitutes, demand is going to become more. So if you have more available substitutes, when the price changes, are you going to be more or less elastic? More elastic, right? So once again, this is where it's not cumulative going into the final, but we're reusing things we've talked about. The fact that we have many sellers in a monopolistic competitive market, we know that demand curve is going to be more elastic. More elastic actually means a flatter curve, which is why I try to draw that monopolistic competitive market. That firm's demand curve is going to be a little bit flatter, okay? Because there, we know that those markets or consumers are going to be a little bit more elastic. They actually have substitutes they can choose from. Okay? Now, in a perfectly competitive market, I think it was a stink bug. In a perfectly competitive market, what is demand? It's horizontal, so it would be perfectly elastic, right? So we're kind of somewhere, once again, somewhere in the middle of the two, okay? So I kind of already drew this out for you, kind of comparing that monopolistic competitive to perfectly competitive, talking about the markup that existed and just kind of how we would depict it. So let's now think about the short run, okay? So I've got some stuff in the slides here. I'm going to jump the gun a little bit, but I think it'll be worthwhile. So before I draw this out for us, let's say I had kind of my usual, it looks like a monopoly market, right? But here it's a monopolistic competitive market. I only have a portion of demand. You solve it initially just like you would for a monopolist. Where is the profit maximizing quantity? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. How do I then set the price? I go up to the demand curve. If my price is above average total cost here, which it is, there my profits would be positive. Okay? So we're going to start out. It looks initially just like we were solving this for a monopolist. So we'll start out with a scenario. And I'm skipping ahead in the slides quite a bit. I'll kind of point out later on in today's class where this would be found in the slides. But I think it makes more sense to do it in this order today. So here's my firm. Now I want to do demand that the firm faces. Here's my twice as steep marginal revenue. Here's my marginal costs. Here's my average total cost curve. Okay. So let's think about two scenarios to start out. Okay. So the first one was here, where I choose the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. I then go up to the demand curve. This is what we had in the slides to set the price. I guess I'll use numbers here. Sorry. First price. That is above my average total cost. So this first price was above my average total cost. So we know that profits, if this is my profit equation, if price is above average total, my profits here are positive, right? So I could then kind of think about the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm selling. Here were my profits before, okay? Now, what if instead, so under this scenario, what should firms do? If we have free entry and exit, if there's positive profits, just like a perfectly competitive market, firms should enter that market, okay? So if firms enter, what's going to happen, right? So as firms enter, I am now splitting, market demand doesn't change. I am now splitting the same market demand with more firms. What's going to happen to my individual demand curve? It's going to be, so if I'm splitting demand with 10 firms, I'm now splitting it with 20, I'm going to have less or a lower proportion of the overall market demand. So my demand curve is going to decrease. How do we draw a demand decrease? A shift to the left, right? So what's going to happen, I'll try to draw these in here. So here's kind of my second demand curve. Demand is going to decrease. When demand decreases, what does that do? It also decreases my marginal revenue curve. So here we can kind of think about, here was like my initial starting point. Here's where my demand curve lowered to. So now where is the profit maximizing quantity? Where my costs haven't changed. So here, before we even work through this is like a nice model because it's intuitive. So more firms enter, I get a smaller piece of the pie, right? I get a smaller proportion of the overall market demand. Do you think I'm going to be able to sell more or less than before? It's just like any demand decrease. Quantity is going to go down, and if there's now more firms, there is more competition, the price I can set is going to be lower as well. Now we can solve that and prove that here, but the intuition is kind of easy for us. But where does marginal cost now equal marginal revenue? At a lower quantity. And when I go up, what do I want here? To my new demand curve, that's going to be at a lower price. Okay. Now, try to draw it kind of perfect here. I've got some graphs that are a little bit cleaner on the slides in a second. But notice as firms entered, well, now at that profit maximizing quantity, what is true about my price relative to my average total costs? I try to draw this in a way such that they are equal. So my profits are now 0. No one enters or exits. That would be our long run. So firms will enter, lowering the quantity and price of the existing firms until profits are 0. Now there's no more incentive for anybody to enter this market. Okay. Now, if we had the flip being true, like the opposite being true, all right? So let's think about a scenario where instead, maybe I start out with, and I'll draw this for us in a second. Let's say I had something like this. And I'm just thinking about long run. We'll kind of move to the short run here in a second. But where would I choose the profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue? I then set the price by going up to the demand curve. In this depiction, what would be true about profits? Price is below average total cost, so profits are negative. What are firms going to want to do? Exit the market, right? So if we had this depiction where we're thinking about, I've got the quantity that the firm is choosing. So here's our here's our overall kind of initial demand curve. Here's our initial marginal revenue curve. Oh, what do I want? I want my marginal cost to look something like this. My average total cost of it, that, right? So when we are choosing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, going up to our demand curve to set the price, notice initially what was true, price was below average total cost, which told us that profits, once again, remember, profits are the quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average total cost. So if price is ever below average total cost, we know profits are negative. What should firms then do? Profits are negative. Eventually, firms are going to exit that market. As they exit, what happens to the slice of the pie that the remaining firms get? They get more, right? There's fewer firms to split. Market demand hasn't changed. The only changes that occur when we have firm entry and exit is the firm's demand curve. When firms exit, the remaining firms get a larger proportion of the overall market demand. They have a higher market share, right? So if I have a higher market share or I have an increase in my firm's demand curve, that's going to be an increase in demand. That's a shift to the right, right? So here I can kind of think about I've got this increase in demand. Right? Let's see here, I want it to be there. My marginal revenue curve will also kind of shift, right? And these should be parallel shifts. I'm doing my best to kind of draw these, but these, right, we're thinking about increases or decreases in demand should be parallel shifts. So now where is the new equilibrium price and quantity? Well, where is my new marginal revenue equal my marginal cost? Looks like it's right here. I then go up to my new demand curve to set the price. So once again, intuitively, when firms exit this market, I get a higher proportion of overall market share. I'm going to be able to sell more. There's fewer competitors. I can sell it also at a higher price, right? So when I'm in a remaining firm, when firms exit this market, that's a good thing for me. Less competition. I can sell more units at a higher price. So more units at a higher price, what's going to happen to my profits? They're going to go up. Sure enough, here, they went from before they were negative. I've got a depiction now where price is exactly equal to average total cost, or as firms exited this market, it eventually pushes profits to then be zero. Okay. So it doesn't matter where we start out. Profits could be positive, profits could be negative. Firm entry and exit will shift that firm's demand curve until in the long run we have zero profits. Now nothing changes. There's no incentive for a firm to enter or exit. Okay. And this is purely thinking about the long run. Okay. Any questions here before we keep moving? Now, under both these scenarios, even when we started out with profits being negative, right? What was true about my price relative to my marginal cost? Price was above marginal cost. So even when profits were negative, we still have a markup in these monopolistic competitive markets. When profits were positive, right? The price we were setting was above our marginal cost. When profits are zero, price is still above our marginal cost. So it doesn't matter what the value of profits are in these monopolistic competitive markets, we're always going to have a markup. All right, price will always be above marginal cost. So if you've somehow identified a point and that's not true, you know you did something wrong. Right? We should always have a markup in these models. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? We get at what? 12:35, right? Or 12:25. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead for a second just to kind of show you. Maybe slightly cleaner depictions of this with colors, more colors, would be if I'm thinking about short run profits are positive, firms entered that market, lowering the demand curve of each remaining firm until profits are zero. Firms started out as negative. Firms would exit that market, which increases the demand curve of the remaining firms. Oh, looks like I forgot to add in my marginal revenue curve. I'll update the slides and add in the marginal revenue curve there, but increasing that demand curve until it pushes us kind of this point where we have profits of zero as well. So the long run, doesn't matter if we've got a perfectly competitive or a monopolistic competitive market, as long as we have free firm entry and exit, profits are going to get driven to zero. We'll talk about some additional concerns we might have later on, but for right now, we get that same long run outcome. Okay? So I skipped ahead a little bit there. I drew it out for us, but you've got some depictions in the slides there as well. We're going to kind of come back here and think now about if we do have positive profits, in the short run, we might have a second decision to make. Because if profits aren't positive and instead they're negative, what's the second decision I have to make in the short run? Just like a perfectly competitive market, do I stay open to minimize my losses or do I shut down and just pay my fixed costs? Okay? So we can operate with positive or negative profits. If my profits are negative, just like a perfectly competitive firm, I then have to make the decision, do I stay open to minimize my losses or do I shut down? Okay? So I'm going to think through this in a slightly different way here. So if I stay open, all right, well, we've got this in the slides, but maybe this will make sense to do something like this, okay? So we'll do price, got my demand curve. We'll do twice as steep marginal revenue curve. We've got my marginal cost curve, and we'll start out something like this, okay? So we're going to start out in a scenario where we're thinking about the price and quantity this monopolistic competitive market chooses results in price being below average total cost. So we know profits are negative, right? So if I stay open, the way that we would calculate profits is still going to be the quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average total cost, okay? Now, I'm going to work through some steps and then summarize it back on this slide. For now, I'm just going to move this to the side for a second. If I shut down, right? Well, let's try something else first. So if I just think about profits being here, if we go back to like perfectly competitive markets, I said you could actually rewrite this average total cost is just the sum of your average variable and average fixed. If we then rearrange this, I had something that looked like this. What is quantity times my average fixed costs? So if I take an average and I multiply it by the number of units I'm producing, that would give me my total. So here, this is really just my total fixed costs. So that was the whole reason behind what was the decision of whether or not we stay open. Wasn't price relative to average total cost, it was price relative to average variable cost, or AVC, right? So if price is above average variable cost, I'm going to be adding a positive amount to profits. So even though I still might have negative profits, they're going to be smaller losses. If price ever is below average variable cost, this becomes an additional negative number. Well, adding in another negative number means my losses are going to be even larger if I stay open, right? So whenever price was below average variable cost, instead of adding this additional negative value, if I shut down, what does this become? If I shut down, quantity is 0. 0 times anything is 0, right? So if I shut down, what do my profits become? Negative fixed costs, which is going to be better when price is below average variable cost, okay? So if price ever falls below average variable, I should just shut down, right? My losses are going to be smaller here, right? And you can kind of think about, put some hypothetical values to this. Maybe here I had fixed cost of 100. Let's say that this value I calculated, if price was above average variable, maybe this would be something like 10. Okay, well, under that scenario, if I stay open, 10 minus 100 would be negative 90. Whereas if I shut down, they would be negative 100. Oh yeah, price was above average variable. I was adding a positive amount here. Now, if price ever becomes below average variable, I'd be adding an additional negative value. So under that scenario, if I stay open, my profits would be what? Negative 110. Whereas if I simply shut down, they're only negative 100. Oh yeah, it was better to shut down when price was below average variable. Right? So this is the same decision making that we talked about with perfectly competitive markets. Nothing's different here. Okay? Now, what is different, we might have to identify from these graphs, is if I shut down, another way of writing down what profits are if I shut down, we said my fixed costs are equal to the quantity I'm selling times my average fixed. If I didn't know my average fixed, another way I could find this is it's the difference between my average total and my average variable. So when we're looking at these visual depictions, and a lot of times when we're just given the numbers or like looking at a balance sheet or income statement of a firm, we're likely going to have information about total and variable costs. We might not have the fixed costs there. So, and here I should put negative. Sorry, there's a negative sign out front because it's negative fixed costs, and I forgot to write that in. So if we shut down, this is a version of the profit equation we can use and connect this to our visual, okay? So you're not going to have to like reproduce this ever, right? This is just kind of, once again, reminding ourselves of why that shutdown rule exists, why we're comparing price to average variable cost, and then just a different way of writing these shutdown profits, okay? So with that in mind, if I then think about a situation where I do have negative profits, okay? Well, what else do I need here to decide if I shut down or stay open? I need to know my average variable costs, right? So I'll do an example where, let's say, my average variable cost looks something like this, okay? So before I even draw anything else in here, should I stay open or shut down? My price is above average variable costs, so I should stay open, right? Now, if I do stay open, I can think about my profits will be the quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost. So let's think about, if I stay open, that quantity I'm selling would be like the base of my rectangle. The difference between price and average total cost would be right here. Here would be kind of my profits if I stay open. Now, these are my profits, but remember, price is below average total cost, so this value would be negative. These are actually profits that are losses, right? They're negative profits. Now, if instead I shut down, I can prove to myself why shutting down would be a worse option. If this is the profit equation we would use to calculate shutdown profits, it's the quantity I'm selling times the difference between what? Average total and average variable costs. So notice here, the rectangle that would represent shutdown profits would be this entire area. So this entire blue area would be my profits if I shut down. Which of these is larger? Well, shutdown profits is a larger area here, but remember, both of these are negative profits. I want to have a smaller negative value, right? So anytime price is above average variable cost, you'll always end up with something that looks like this, which is that if I shut down, I'm actually going to incur more losses than if I stay open. Okay? Questions on this idea before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we kind of already mentioned this, but we can always identify the markup as well. It doesn't matter if I have negative profits, if I'm shutting down, staying open. So under this scenario, I still have a markup. Price is above marginal cost. But what should I be doing to maximize profits? Well, price is below average total, so I know profits are going to be negative. But is price above or below average variable cost? It is. So I should be shutting down, right? So even when I have a shutdown decision, right, if I stay open, here would be my profits. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead because I think I added in a slide. So here's my profits if I shut down, right? Here's my profits if I stay open, right? I'm operating, setting this price. If I shut down, we said another way of calculating profits if I shut down is the quantity I'm producing times the difference between average total and average variable. So here, if I stay open, here are my losses. If I shut down, here are my losses. Which is better? I want smaller losses, so here it would actually be advantageous to shut down. So I drew one out for you where it was advantageous to stay open. We could kind of do a similar thought experiment where is it advantageous to shut down whenever that price falls below that average variable cost. Okay? And just a different depiction as to why. Okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay? So similar ideas that we talked about with perfectly competitive firms. Let me see here what I have this set to be. We'll extend this out to be a little bit later. This should be relatively easy. So I don't think it'll take too much time. So I think the number is 30.54 once I get this published. So we'll kind of go to that homepage, scroll all the way down. In-class quiz 13.1. Once again, I think it's 30.54. Let's see if my memory is good today. Yes, 30.54. All right, so we're going to hit return here. I'm going to go back into it. 30.54 should get us into that quiz. We then have two questions that we're going to look at. Should be, I think, like I said, these should be not too bad, right? But I'm going to use one to make some like additional points that don't show up in the question, okay? So everyone getting into that quiz, okay? Wi-Fi a little slow. Some of us getting in. Head nods, thumbs up, are always appreciated. Is anybody into the quiz? Yes, okay. So if it takes a little bit of time, we'll kind of hopefully by the time we get done, I've just got it set for another 10 minutes. 12:05, make sure we're getting submitted prior to that. But 30.54 is that number, okay? So if I'm thinking here, if I've got a monopolistically competitive firm, this should hopefully be an easy question. First of all, We start out solving these models very similar to what we did for a monopolist. It's simply where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So what quantity is that going to be here? I think these black lines are 2 and the gray lines are 1, so it's going to be right at a quantity of 6. What is the price I'm going to set? It's not going to be 4, right? What do? I go up to the demand curve at that quantity of 6, and I set the price at 12, okay? So the quantity I'm going to set to maximize profits will be at 6. I then go up to the demand curve to kind of set that quantity, right? The price that would result in 6 units being sold would be a price of $12, okay? What would my markup be here if I asked you for it? So the price is 12. Markup is the difference between price and marginal cost. What's my marginal cost value at a quantity of 6? The marginal cost of the last unit is 4, so my markup would be 8. Okay? Not a question that was asked here, but if I did, that's how you would solve it. I might be bringing these things up because I know what's going to be on the quiz in the final. I've already got it written. Okay? Any questions on that one before we keep moving? Now, we already talked through more complicated examples here. But let's say I gave you the same setup, but I now put in average total and average variable costs. Okay? So the quantity and price shouldn't change because I'm using the same curves as before. So we had a quantity of 6 and a price of 12. First of all, what is going to be true at that quantity of 6 where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost? The price of 12, is it above or below my average total cost? So profits will be. So just mentioning as we work through more problems, especially like next week, I'm going to try to start, I try to do this throughout the semester, but sprinkle in test taking techniques. If I were on an exam right away, what would I do right now? Knowing that profits are negative, I know I have to find the value, but just in case I get lost in the math and forget that what should profits be here, negative, I cross the positive values out right away. Don't make that mistake. I know I have to eventually calculate the value, but I know they can't be positive if price is below average total cost. Okay? So my price is below. I know it's going to be negative 12 or negative 60, right? How would I calculate profits? Well, am I going to stay open or shut down? That price of 12 is above average variable cost, so I'm going to stay open, right? What are my profits if I stay open? The quantity I'm producing times the difference between price and average total cost. So my price is 12, average total cost is 14. So that'd be what? 2 times 6. Now it's not 2 times 6 because it's price minus average total cost. Price is 12, average total. So it's actually negative 2 times 6 or negative 12 is profits. Which once again, if I forgot, before I started to solve for the value, what did we say we should have done? Crossed off the positive values right away. I don't make that mistake of forgetting the negative sign. Okay? Any questions on that idea? Okay. So everybody able to kind of get into the quiz okay? Hopefully we can get it submitted. It's still open for another 5 minutes. Submit it now, though. I'm just going to add in an additional question or additional way you could solve this that might help you on the quiz or the exam. Okay? So if we stayed open, which we said we should, our profits were what? Negative 12, right? Now, looking at this ahead of time, if I know price is above average variable cost, what should be true about my profits if I stay open relative to if I shut down? They should be a smaller negative value. Now, this won't always be the case because I can change the distractor answers. But I'm going to guess, if I gave you one of these, if I just had to guess without doing the work, if staying open should result in smaller losses, should I choose negative 60 or negative 12 here? Negative 12. Now, it's not, I could have given you negative 6, and that wouldn't be the case. But we can start to think through these different scenarios of staying open versus shutting down. So we found profits to be negative 12. How could I prove to myself that I should have stayed open? If these were my profits from staying open, if I calculate the profits from shutting down, they should be a larger negative value. So we'll go back to where we were thinking about what are my profits if I shut down? right here. Negative my fixed cost, and this was just a different way of writing fixed costs. So at that quantity of 6, our average total costs were 14, right? That's what we were doing before. We had 6, 12, 14, which gave us that value of negative 12. But if I shut down, what would my profits be? Well, we have the quantity, we have average total cost. Wait a second here because I clicked on the wrong button. There we go. At that quantity of 6, what is my average variable cost? 9. So if I plug 9 into here, if I shut down, what would my profits be? Negative 6 times 5 or negative 30. If I shut down, my losses would have actually been larger than if I decided to stay open, which is what that rule of price relative to average variable cost told us to do. And so anytime you have like a short run example where profits are negative, you can always kind of prove to yourself that you're doing the right thing. But you could calculate profits from staying open and shutting down, and they should, if you're doing it correctly, always line up with whether or not price was above or below average variable cost, right? In this case, price is above average variable cost, so those profits from staying open are a smaller negative value. Okay. Any questions on that idea or where I was pulling that 9 from? It was just that average variable cost, whoops, at that quantity of 6. Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. All right. So we are out of that. What did we skip over here? What do I want to do? So here was our top hat questions. This was just me building. You guys don't have these in your slides. This is maybe for Thursday's class. I might kind of revisit some of this. We're going to skip ahead, save this for Thursday's class. So we'll skip through advertising and branding, right? We'll save that for next class. This is going to be a little bit more related to like changes in the elasticity of demand. So I want to make some interesting points here. So we'll kind of pick up on that next class. What I do want to look at, we already kind of, I mentioned later on, connecting in the slides, connected to what we did earlier, firm entry and exit when we have positive or negative profits. So we're going to skip all the way to, here we go, this slide here, right? We're thinking about monopolistically competitive markets in the long run, okay? So we already said that firm entry and exit should result in profits for these monopolistically competitive markets to be what in the long run? 0, okay? Now we're now going to point out some differences between the monopolistically competitive market and the perfectly competitive market, okay? So I've got something in the slides here. We've got a question I might use next class. I've got a depiction. I'm going to draw something out that's a little bit more detailed so we can kind of reference these. I would copy down what I'm about to write out because it's just going to be a little bit more detailed here, okay? So we'll get rid of this one because these markers are bleeding pretty bad. So let's think about if I have a monopolistically competitive market, here's the firms, the demand curve that the firm faces. They're also going to face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. And I'm going to draw this in such a way. So I want here what? Try to get marginal cost to hit average total at its minimum point. But here we've got, starting out, here's where the monopolistically competitive market would choose, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We could then think about, they go up to the demand curve to set the price. All right. So what have I depicted here? Well, what is the value of profits for these monopolistically competitive firms? Price is equal to average total cost, so profits are 0. Okay. Everybody with me up to this point? So we've marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's how we found quantity. This should look pretty similar to a monopolist, other than there aren't positive profits. We're at 0 profits. Okay. So if this is the case, let's start to think now about what happens to the surplus in the market because it's not perfectly competitive. Perfectly competitive is like our ideal scenario for society, which is where total surplus should be maximized. So let's think through what would consumer surplus be under this monopolistically competitive market? Well, it should be the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. What should represent marginal benefits? Demand. What represents the consumer's marginal costs? The price this monopolistically competitive market is choosing. So our consumer surplus would be this triangle here, right? What about producer surplus? So once again, anytime we talk about this word surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. What are the marginal costs to the producers? Well, that would just be their marginal cost curve. In fact, we could almost think about the market supply represents marginal costs. So if I'm looking at one firm's marginal cost, it's almost like this is the firm's supply curve, right? So the firm's marginal cost would represent like that firm's supply curves. What is the marginal benefit to the producer? Whatever they're selling the good for, right? So to them, that price is a good thing. To the consumer, it was a bad thing, right? So where would producer surplus be here? The area below price, but above marginal costs, right? Okay. So total surplus would be the sum of those two things, okay? So we're now going to think about what if this was a perfectly competitive market, okay? If this was a perfectly competitive market, where would the equilibrium price and quantity be? Where supply is equal to demand, right? Now, I have kind of a weird one here where average total cost is low. I probably should have drawn this a little bit better. But I'm wanting to focus on just the implications on total surplus if we look at the firm level here, okay? So where would my supply curve for the firm be equal to the demand curve for the firm? Right here. So this should be the quantity of a perfectly competitive firm, okay? So notice a monopolistically competitive market, that firm is going to choose a quantity that's lower than what it would choose if it was in a perfectly competitive market. And that makes sense because they don't have complete monopoly power, but they have some monopoly power, right? So in the market, we're not going to see the quantity restricted as much by monopolistically competitive firms as we would to a monopolist, but we're still going to see that it goes down. Now, where would the price be if they were acting like a perfectly competitive firm? It would be where their supply is equal to their demand curve. So if this was a perfectly competitive market, or the firm was acting as though it was, they would set the price at where supply is equal to demand. So notice the monopolistically competitive firm chooses a lower quantity and a higher price. Okay? Everybody with me on that? Now, I'm not going to draw this in, but I'm going to use my hands, right? So you'll have the Zoom to go back to. Maybe next class, if we have time, I'll add an additional drawing. I think I've got something in the slides that does something similar. But I think we can kind of make the point. So let's say I wanted to compare the consumer surplus of a monopolistically and a perfectly competitive market and the producer surplus of those two markets. We'll start with the easier one first. If this was a perfectly competitive market, what would my consumer surplus be? The area below demand, but above this lower price, right? All the way out to that higher quantity. So consumer surplus would be this entire triangle. So when I have a monopolistic competitive market, what has happened to consumer surplus? It's lower. It's just like a monopolist, right? Consumer surplus is going to be lower than the perfectly competitive market. Now, intuitively, if I have some monopoly power, what's likely going to happen to producer surplus? It should go up. We can kind of think about if this was a perfectly competitive market, what would producer surplus be? the area below price, but above my marginal cost or supply curve. So it would be this triangle. Well, notice if it's a monopolistically competitive market, I lost a little bit of producer surplus here, but I gained a hell of a lot more there. So what has happened at producer surplus? It is now higher, right? So just like with a monopolist, who benefits in these monopolistic competitive markets? Producers. Who is hurt? Consumers. Now, here's where it gets a little bit weird to think about and tricky. So producer surplus went up. What happened, though, to the profits of the firms? In the long run, so if we're looking at the long run of a perfectly competitive and monopolistic competitive market, in both models, profits should be 0. So even though producer surplus is higher, producer surplus is not synonymous with profits, right? Producer surplus, in a way, because we're using the marginal cost curve, what does producer surplus kind of ignore? What will never show up in my marginal costs? It's the same no matter how much I produce, fixed costs. So in some of these short-run models, our producer surplus won't be synonymous with profits, right? So kind of a counterintuitive. I said earlier we had some intuitive results. This one's a little bit counterintuitive. But we can see here, I don't want to focus as much on what's happening to producer surplus. I'd more likely to be asking you a question of what happens to consumer surplus here, and we definitely can see that goes down. Now, there's also something else we can look at here, and I'm going to break it down a slightly different way. But if I'm selling below the perfectly competitive quantity, every unit I'm not selling, what is the total surplus that would exist? Well, it's just the marginal benefits and marginal costs in the market, which would be simply the difference between the supply and the demand curve for that firm. So every unit the monopolistically competitive firm is not producing, all of this would have been surplus if they acted like a perfectly competitive firm. So what does this represent? Deadweight loss because they have some monopolistically competitive power. Okay. You know, we got a lot going on here in this graph. Are there any questions before I add in one more thing? So maybe a slightly easier kind of summary slide here, right? Just in terms of what is deadweight loss? It's that difference between the demand curve and the marginal cost for all those units that the monopolistically competitive market isn't choosing to provide to the market. Okay. Now, the value of deadweight loss is always going to be the area of this triangle. Okay. So just to clean this up a little bit, I'm going to draw something out just so we have less going on in the same graph, and maybe a marker that works. So we said, here's the firm's demand curve. Here's my marginal cost. Here's the firm's marginal revenue. Okay. I just want to focus on the how do I want to say this? I just want to focus on the surplus here. So I'm going to leave off average total cost just to simplify it a little bit. So we could add it in, but I'm going to focus on something, so I'm leaving it out just for right now. Okay. So where would the monopolistically competitive firm choose? So what quantity is this firm choosing? Where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They then go up to the demand curve to set the price. All right. Where would the perfectly competitive market be? We said another way to think about their marginal cost, that's the firm's supply curve. So the perfectly competitive market should choose where supply is equal to demand, right? So that would be out here at this point. So here's our perfectly competitive quantity. We're not going to end up needing this, but here's our perfectly competitive price. Okay. So we said this area here represented what? Deadweight loss. So let's think about two definitions we have and think about why there exists deadweight loss not only in these monopolistic competitive markets, we could even think a little bit harder about monopoly markets that we've talked about. So one thing that we've already talked about is the markup. So the markup is the difference between price and marginal cost. Okay. We're also now going to have this definition. We're going to call this excess capacity. So excess capacity is going to be the difference between what a perfectly competitive market would choose to produce, the number of units. And here we're looking at a monopolistically competitive market, but technically we could compare this to a monopoly market as well. So it's just that difference between what quantity is the market you're looking at producing, monopoly or monopolistically competitive, compared to where the perfectly competitive market would be, right? So here, if we think about what deadweight loss is, not B, sorry, deadweight loss, at this quantity, notice what is the height of my deadweight loss triangle always going to be? The difference between price and where I'm at on my marginal cost curve. So what is the height of that triangle always going to represent? My markup, right? So, and we're going to use this next class. So I'm setting us up for next class with this, right? So I'm going to assume you know it when we start. What is the base of this triangle always going to be? The difference between the quantity the monopolistic competitive market chooses and the perfectly competitive market. So here, the base of this triangle is always going to be our excess capacity, right? And then we have linear supply and demand curves, so we always have to multiply this by 1/2, right? But basically, where does our deadweight loss come from? It comes from the fact that relative to a perfectly competitive market, we have firms choosing to have a markup, right? They're setting price above whatever their marginal costs were. And we're also getting fewer units sold by those firms. So we're kind of losing on two dimensions, right? So part of that deadweight loss comes from the fact that we're selling fewer units. Part of it comes from the fact that we're not operating at this efficient scale of production where that price is equal to our marginal cost, is equal to the minimum point of our average total cost curve, right? So this deadweight loss triangle, if I asked you to identify, or in fact, I could like not give you the graph, as long as you know the quantity of these markets, you know the price and the marginal cost, you could actually tell me what the deadweight loss is. Because deadweight loss will always be your excess capacity times the markup of the firm times 1/2, because we're dealing with linear supply and demand curves. Okay? So trying to connect to some of these things that we're talking about, kind of the visuals in this graph, that's where our deadweight loss is coming from. Okay? Any questions on this idea? Okay. So I think we'll save this stuff for next class. So I jumped the gun a little bit, just introducing this idea of excess capacity. We'll talk more about that on Thursday's class. We're also going to kind of focus on differences in elasticity and ways that firms can influence the elasticity of their firm demand curve. So we'll likely probably finish up a little bit. You guys had a whole break. Just give me one more minute, okay? So we'll likely finish up a little bit early. So if you have time to review that practice final or you have old quiz questions you have questions on, probably the last 15 minutes of class or so, or 20, I can do some review. So if you have some questions you want to see worked through already, you might have a little bit of time at the end of Thursday's class. Otherwise, office hours are kind of back to normal, Mondays and Wednesdays, 10 to 1. Try to stay kind of warm out there, and I will see you on Thursday.